picture this. You're a CIA officer deep undercover in Iran in the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
You're in the middle of orchestrating a coup when suddenly
Ah.
you get an urgent message from headquarters.
Ooh.
Abort mission. Get out now.
Wow.
What do? Follow orders or trust your gut. That's the exact dilemma Kermit Roosevelt Jr. faced back in 1953. And that's where our deep dive begins today.
That's quite a hook.
It is a gripping story, right?
Yeah. And you've gathered some incredible sources for us to delve into.
I have.
Declassified CIA documents, memoirs, historical analyses, all shedding light on the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat.
Exactly. And focusing specifically on...
And Kermit Roosevelt Jr.'s role.
Yes, Kermit Roosevelt Jr.'s pivotal role in it all.
It's going to be fascinating to untangle this pivotal event.
Yes.
Explore the motivations of the key players and uncover the lasting consequences that we still feel today.
Absolutely.
I mean, this isn't just ancient history. This is a story of power intrigue and the long shadow of covert operations.
And you have to remember the context, too. We're talking about 1953.
Oh, yeah. The Cold War is simmering. And Iran, with its vast oil reserves, becomes a focal point for both the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Right. It's like a high-stakes chess match with Iran as the most valuable piece on the board.
Precisely. So when Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, decides to nationalize the oil industry, which was a direct challenge to Western interests...
It was.
It sends shockwaves through the global political landscape.
Okay, so let's break down the players in this intricate game.
Okay.
First, we have Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, and a CIA operative.
Wow, what a lineage.
I know, it's like a real-life James Bond.
Yeah.
Except for the deep understanding of history and culture.
Yeah, which made him uniquely suited for this type of operation.
Absolutely.
I mean, Roosevelt was known for his ability to build relationships.
He was.
And his audacity.
Definitely.
He was not afraid to take risks, and that becomes very evident in his actions during the coup.
It does.
Then you have Mossadegh, a charismatic and popular figure who really championed Iranian nationalism.
He genuinely believed that Iran's oil belonged to its people, not to foreign companies.
He did, and this is where things get complicated.
They do.
Because while Mossadegh's move was popular at home, it was seen as a direct threat to Western powers who had been heavily reliant on Iranian oil for decades.
Right.
And it's this clash of national interests that really sets the stage for the coup.
And let's not forget about the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
Right, the Shah of Iran.
Iran's monarch at the time.
Yes.
Initially, he was hesitant about the coup.
He was.
But he eventually becomes a key figure, almost like a pawn.
Like a pawn thrust into the center of this high-stakes game.
Exactly.
Yeah, his initial hesitation is understandable.
It is.
And I mean, he's caught between wanting to maintain his power and the potential backlash from a population that largely supported Mossadegh.
Right.
But the promise of Western backing and the fear of losing his throne ultimately pushed him to support the coup.
Okay, so we have our key players now. Let's dive into the plan itself. Codenamed Operation AX.
Operation AX.
A joint CIA-MI6 operation.
Wow.
With the goal of removing Mossadegh from power and reinstating the Shah.
It sounds straightforward enough.
On paper it does.
But I imagine things were far more complicated.
They were much more complicated. Operation AX involved a complex blend of propaganda, bribery, and even instigating street demonstrations, all designed to destabilize Mossadegh's government.
A high-risk gamble.
Absolutely, with potentially explosive consequences.
Yeah, and as we delve deeper into the source material, you'll see just how precarious this operation truly was.
Yes, the initial attempt planned for August 16th was botched due to a leak.
Oh, no.
Can you imagine the tension being deep undercover, knowing your operation is unraveling?
I could only imagine the pressure.
This is where Roosevelt's personality truly shines through.
How so?
Most operatives would have retreated.
Yeah.
But not him.
No.
He made the incredibly risky decision to press on.
Wow.
Despite orders from headquarters to withdraw.
Talk about nerves of steel.
Absolutely. He must have been incredibly confident in his abilities and his understanding of the situation on the ground.
He must have.
He brought in General Fazlollah Zahidi, a military strongman, to replace Mossadegh.
So Roosevelt wasn't just improvising, he was escalating the operation.
He was, and his next move is particularly cunning.
Oh.
He utilizes the Rashidian brothers, former MI6 agents, with a network of, let's just say, influential individuals to instigate pro-Shah unrest in the streets.
Interesting.
This tactic actually mirrored the methods Mossadegh had used earlier to pressure the Shah.
Oh, so turning the tables on him.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating detail.
It is.
But it does raise questions about the ethics of using such tactics.
It does.
Especially when the objective is to install a leader who might not have the full support of the people.
Right. It really highlights the moral complexities of covert operations.
It does. On the one hand, they're often shrouded in secrecy and involve manipulation.
Right.
But on the other hand, they can be seen as necessary tools.
Okay.
In a world where superpowers are vying for influence.
It's a real gray area, isn't it?
It is a very gray area.
And to make matters even more complicated, the U.S. ambassador meets with Mossadegh.
He does.
Urging him to quell the unrest while knowing full well that the U.S. is behind it all.
Oh, wow.
Deception was a key element of this operation.
It seems that way. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to create the illusion of chaos and instability.
Exactly.
Ultimately forcing Mossadegh into a corner.
What a tangled web indeed.
It is.
So before the break, we were discussing the intricate web of Operation Ajax, this joint CIA-MI6 mission to remove Mossadegh from power in Iran.
Right, a lot of moving parts.
And we left off with the U.S. ambassador meeting with Mossadegh, feigning concern, while secretly orchestrating the unrest.
It was all part of the plan, you see, to make Mossadegh appear weak and unable to control the situation.
Right, to make him look bad.
Exactly. And this really sets the stage for what we could call the turning point, August 19th, 1953.
The day the coup reaches its climax.
The climax of the coup.
And you mentioned before the break that the plan involved pro-Shah crowds.
I did.
What role did they play in all of this?
Well, these crowds, which included athletes from these houses of strength, think weightlifters, wrestlers, strongmen, they were essentially paid to create a spectacle in support of the Shah.
Wow.
Marching through the streets, targeting key locations like the radio station.
Interesting.
Almost like a scene out of a Hollywood movie.
It's quite a contrast to the typical image of a political uprising.
It is.
You've got these muscle-bound men parading through the streets, shouting pro-Shah slogans.
It's very theatrical.
It is.
But it had the desired effect.
It did.
I mean, the sheer spectacle of it all added to the sense of chaos and momentum, making it seem like the Shah had overwhelming popular support.
So meanwhile, the Shah himself is in exile in Rome. He's off in Rome. What's his reaction to all of this?
So when he hears news of the coup unfolding, his reaction is rather telling.
Okay.
He exclaims, "I knew it. They love me."
Wow.
It reveals a certain detachment from the reality on the ground, I'd say.
Yeah.
And perhaps a naive belief that this orchestrated uprising was a genuine outpouring of support for his return.
Yeah, a very interesting perspective there.
Yeah, it's a fascinating little window into his character.
It is. But back in Tehran, the situation is anything but naive.
No, it's not.
The pro-Shah crowds, emboldened by the CIA's covert support, gained control of the radio station.
Which was crucial at the time, right?
A crucial propaganda tool back then.
A very significant victory for the coup plotters.
It was.
Because controlling the airwaves allowed them to spread pro-Shah messages, further adding to the perception that the tide was turning against Mossadegh.
So how did Mossadegh react to all of this?
Well, initially he remained defiant.
He did.
But he found himself increasingly isolated. Yeah, his supporters were outnumbered, outmaneuvered. And even members of the military who had once been loyal began to waver.
Wow.
Sensing which way the wind was blowing, as they say.
It sounds like the walls were closing in.
The walls were closing in.
Was Roosevelt still directing everything from behind the scenes at this point?
Absolutely. He was still the puppet master, you could say.
Wow.
Coordinating the different factions, ensuring Zaidi was ready to assume power.
Right.
And keeping Washington informed, albeit selectively, about the unfolding events.
Of course.
And it's important to remember that he was still technically operating against orders at this point.
That's incredible how much control he managed to exert over the situation.
It is quite a feat.
But how did Mossadegh's government ultimately fall? Was it a dramatic showdown?
Well, the final act takes place at Mossadegh's own residence.
At his residence?
Yes, pro-Shah forces backed by tanks stormed the building.
Wow.
Engaging in a pretty fierce firefight with Mossadegh's loyalists.
So not exactly the bloodless coup that some might imagine.
No, not at all. It was a stark reminder that coups often involve violence and bloodshed.
A reminder that things can turn violent quickly.
Exactly. And what was the human cost of this operation?
Yeah, what was the cost?
Sadly, hundreds were killed or injured in the fighting that day.
Oh, wow.
Both among the pro-Shah forces and those defending Mossadegh.
A tragic end to what had begun as a seemingly nonviolent power struggle.
Very tragic.
So Mossadegh is defeated. What becomes of him?
Well, he actually manages a pretty dramatic escape from his home,
He does.
evading capture for a short time.
Okay.
But realizing that defeat was inevitable,
Yep.
he eventually surrenders.
He does.
And he's placed under house arrest where he spends the rest of his days dying in relative obscurity in 1967.
A sad end for a man who had championed Iranian independence.
Yes, it is.
And what about the victors? The Shah returns to Iran triumphant.
He does. Flown back from his room in exile.
Okay.
Greeted with fanfare cheering crowds, he reclaims his throne seemingly more powerful than ever thanks to this U.S.-backed coup.
And the oil companies, I imagine they were pleased with the outcome.
To say they were pleased is an understatement.
It is.
I mean, with the Shah back in power,
Yeah.
Western oil companies, especially American ones, regain control of Iranian oil,
They do.
securing access to these vast reserves and solidifying their influence in the region.
So it seems like a victory for all involved.
It does.
The Shah regains his throne, the U.S. gets what it wants, and the oil companies are happy. A happy ending.
Well, not quite. You see, as with most covert operations,
Yeah.
there are often unintended consequences that ripple through history long after the initial victory.
Right.
And the 1953 coup is no exception.
Those unintended consequences you mentioned earlier. This is where things get really interesting, isn't it?
This is where it gets really interesting.
So before the break, we were talking about that seeming victory of the 1953 Iranian coup.
Right. The Shah was back on his throne. The oil was flowing westward.
But you hinted at some long-term fallout that wasn't so rosy?
Exactly. You see, while the coup achieved its immediate objectives, it left a deep scar on Iran's political and social landscape.
It did.
And it's a classic example of how those short-term gains can lead to long-term instability.
So what were some of these unintended consequences that rippled through history?
Well, for starters, the coup fueled anti-Western sentiment among Iranians.
Makes sense.
I mean, many felt betrayed by the U.S. and the U.K.,
Right.
who had interfered in their internal affairs and undermined a democratically elected leader.
They had.
And this resentment, it festered for years.
I bet.
And it played a significant role in the Islamic Revolution that toppled the Shah just 26 years later.
Wow. So the very event intended to secure Western interests in Iran ultimately paved the way for the rise of an Islamic Republic that was fundamentally opposed to those interests.
Precisely. It's a stark reminder that meddling in the internal affairs of other nations often backfires.
It is. And the coup also sowed the seeds of distrust towards the Shah.
Right, because before the coup, he enjoyed a certain degree of popularity.
He did.
But his acceptance of Western intervention tarnished his image.
Understandable.
And weakened his legitimacy in the eyes of many Iranians.
It's fascinating how this single event had such a profound impact on the course of Iranian history.
It really is.
Makes you wonder, did the U.S. learn any lessons from this experience? Did it change the way they approached covert operations?
Unfortunately, it seems like maybe the wrong lessons were learned.
Oh,
Because the CIA, in the aftermath of the coup, seemed to embrace the idea that covert operations could be used to shape global events,
Right.
leading to a series of interventions throughout the Cold War and beyond.
I mean, some were successful, some weren't.
Right, exactly. So it seems like they doubled down on a strategy that ultimately proved to be counterproductive in the long run.
So they kept going down that road.
They did. And even Kermit Roosevelt himself later expressed regret.
He did.
He did, that the CIA hadn't learned a more nuanced lesson from Iran.
Okay.
He believed that each situation was unique
Right.
and required a deep understanding of local dynamics rather than this one-size-fits-all approach.
It sounds like even the mastermind behind the operation had second thoughts.
He did. And what about the official narrative? How has the U.S. government addressed its role in the 1953 coup?
Yeah, what have they said?
Well, decades later, the CIA declassified documents acknowledging its involvement,
They did.
although some argue that key details remain hidden.
Right. It was a partial admission, maybe an attempt to reconcile with Iran,
Maybe.
but it also raised more questions than it answered.
It did. And what about the British? Have they ever come clean about their involvement?
That's a good question. What have they said?
Well, the British government has remained tight-lipped,
Oh, really?
refusing to officially confirm or deny its role.
Wow.
Even though key figures like Monty Woodhouse, a British intelligence officer involved in the operation, have written memoirs detailing MI6's participation.
They have.
They have. It's a stark contrast to the CIA's limited transparency.
It is a stark contrast.
Right.
So what does all of this mean for us, for anyone listening who wants to understand this complex event
I think the 1953 Iranian coup serves as a cautionary tale about the complexities and the potential pitfalls of foreign intervention.
It does.
It highlights the unintended consequences that can ripple through history, shaping the fate of nations and the lives of millions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It forces us to grapple with those ethical dilemmas inherent in covert operations.
It does.
And to question the pursuit of short-term gains at the expense of long-term stability.
Exactly. And it really leaves us with a lingering question.
What's that?
If the 1953 coup hadn't happened, would Iran be a different place today?
That is the question, isn't it? It's a question without easy answers.
There are no easy answers.
But it underscores the profound significance of this event and the need to learn from history's mistakes.
It does. It's a question worth pondering, and we hope this deep dive has given you the insights and context to form your own conclusions.
I think it has. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you on the next episode as we continue to explore the hidden corners of history and unravel the complexities of our world.